All right, let's talk about what you do after you MIDI drag a musical idea into your DAW. As we know, a lot of the latest VSTs have MIDI drag, including remidi, what we're testing here today, Scalar, TuneTrack products, UJAM can do it, PerkX can do it now, just about anything, the orchestra. We have all these different ways to get musical ideas into our DAW. But what do we do after we get it there? How can we make it come alive, be more dynamic, more musical, more realistic? So I've come up with 13 steps, just roughly, some of the things you can do to make your raw data come alive. So let's start here. First of all, you'll never know how to make a musical, and in this case example, string quartet sound, if you've never heard real string quartet in real life, or at least on YouTube. And so why not do that first? It makes sense. So for this little exercise, one of the first things I did was to go on YouTube and look up string quartets live playing. And there's some great examples on YouTube. There's one called Attacca Quartet. And it's just 4 players playing inside a small church or chapel, and they're playing live together. A couple violins and viola and a cello. So it's a good reference to hear you need to hear what it's supposed to sound like before you even start working. So your ears are slightly trained. They have some reference. So reference tracks or reference music is a good idea, number 1. Number 2, when you get your data and you drag it in this case, remidi, and we've got the Beethoven Cello Sonata number 3. We have a chunk of it here, and I dragged it in using the MIDI drag onto 4 tracks. So it's a good idea when you drag it in to take a look at all the data. And we'll look here, I'll drag this down a little bit, and you can see all 4 tracks. So if I go from the top here, you can see there's a track which looks like it would be a violin, even though it may not have been. It's in that register because it was I transposed it 1 octave up. Down here, it looks like it would be a good idea to be used for viola because it's the original placement. Number 3, and I'll isolate that here. This is the data I'm using for the cello. It didn't specifically tell me this is cello, but I know it's a cello sonata, so I know there's cello in there. They may all have been written for cello, but it doesn't matter because you can logically divide up your MIDI data to what makes sense for you. That's what this DAW is all about, the ability to change things and edit things. So I just made sure it was in a good register for a cello, so I put that on a cello track. And the same thing for a double bass. I could see when I dragged it in that it was in the double bass space, so to speak, in its play range. And I said, yeah, that's probably a double bass rhythm of some sort, and the short notes. And so that's how I started. I just divided it up in ways that make sense. So that's number 2. When you bring in your MIDI data, divide it into tracks that make sense for what your instruments you're going to play it with. Just check the registers and what key ranges your data is at, and make sure that you have instruments that play in those realistic ranges. So that's another thing. That's number 2 that you can, even before you start playing, you can set things up to help you. Number 3 would be articulations, and make sure you have a bunch of articulations to give you a realistic sound. Unfortunately, if your string library only offers you sustain, staccato, sustain, and maybe 1 legato and a pizzicato, you can do a lot, but you're not going to have the nuances, the accents, and the variation for a really dynamic piece of music. But thankfully, almost all libraries now come with a whole host of different articulations. Today I'm using the VSL Sola Strings, and they have a ton of articulations, so that won't be an issue here today. Possibly knowing how to use all these articulations might be an issue because they all offer different musical character, but they have to be used in a way that makes sense. You know, the notes should be the right size. You don't want to be using, you know, performance spiccatos on very long sustained notes. So you have to have a basic understanding of your articulations and what size of note. So some basic knowledge of articulation. Number 4, velocity. And maybe this is a good time to actually play what we dragged in before we talk about velocity. If you see on these tracks here, they have a velocity lane, and most DAWs have lanes for data, controller data. And you can see it here as I drag it up, make it bigger. You can see that a lot of the velocity is all stagnant. It's all just full velocity. And there's not any variation in the amount, just a slight variation in the amount of velocity. So that's number 2. You've got to change that up. Or that would be number 4, is make sure your velocity can be changed and become more dynamic. So let's play this little musical idea as it was dragged in raw from remidi. We have 4 different instruments, and they're all on like a staccato type articulation. I think they're pretty much on staccato. And let's just play it without any manipulation, without any finesse, and we'll see how stagnant and unrealistic it is. So we can hear some musical ideas in there, and if I select all the lanes, you can see all the data stacked up. We can hear and see a lot of musical ideas. It's in the key of A major, and I've got that set up in my DAW, and that's another thing you can do. You can set up your DAW to have your chord track set up, and we might as well have that set up and help you. And so, okay, we know that in this case, the controller data, the velocity is just too stagnant. So we know we have to be able to change that. All right, so I think for the rest, now we're going to listen to it as it's played with more, after being finessed a certain amount with different articulations, taking some of these things into account, how they can change the music to sound more alive. So let's listen to that now. All right, so I'll select them all. You can see the MIDI data as it plays. And we'll play it now. All right, so now that we've heard it with a lot of these ideas in play, let's take a look at what I did to, first of all, make that the velocity change. So we can see here, originally the velocity stagnant, no change in velocity except for a small tail off here, just kind of default little finish here. But we could really enhance that. If we go to our strings and we just solo the violin and play it, you can see that I've taken my draw tool and I've changed the velocity just by drawing in different velocity amounts here and really gave it some dynamic range. One will be high up, one will be low, one will be high, especially in the shorts. Shorts really benefit from very dynamic velocity. So that string player is really playing very dynamically. So let's just hear it soloed. If we go to the right track, we can look at it. All right. And if you take a look at the player, you can see the articulations that we're changing as it goes. I think there's 5 or 6 different articulations in this one violin track. So you can see the articulations changing rapidly as I use an expression map, and that's another key feature here, is have some way of changing expressions, either using an expression map, and I've gone over how to use expression maps, how I use it with the VSL, and there are other videos on YouTube how to set up an expression map in Cubase and other places. So that's another key. So you want to have some way of switching those articulations in a musical fast way. So we've changed articulation, we've changed up from originally being stagnant and the velocity. Now let's take a look at another controller lane data, and our 5th actual item on the list is expression data. Now also here you can see this has an expression little lane here. And that can be animated, or you can use an expression pedal to bring expression into your chosen articulation. And all the articulations have expression. And expression is different than velocity and is different than volume. When sample makers make their library, they have different expressions, or they have different characteristics of their samples that will change according to this, how high your expression goes, up and down on that little indicator there, which means that instead of just changing volume, you're hearing different characteristics of the double bass, or whatever, in this case the violin, as it gets higher and higher up in expression, until where it's full expression, you're getting like a robust, full characteristic sound from that violin. If you put it lower, it'll be quieter. Even though it'll sound quieter, it's kind of like played quieter, not just a volume thing. It's not a velocity or a volume thing. It's different, and that's why libraries have this special lane and this thing called expression. It's different than volume. So you want to animate that. You want to bring in more and less expression as your music heightens and gets more interesting and builds to these little musical crescendos. And so in this case, for the violin, I took my draw tool and I drew in a bit of a little hill here, a little mountain of data, which is bringing up the expression from very little to higher at this high impact there, and as it builds to a small crescendo with the short notes to the height there, and then falls off to almost nothing there. So you want to use the controller data. You want to use velocity. You want to use your expression. So those are 2 things you can do. And if we go to our viola, we see the same thing here, slightly different, but the same idea. And if we play that, if we look at the raw data, it's the same here. No expression, no velocity, no articulations, to here where we have articulations, velocity, and expression. And if we solo the viola, so you can see it build, the expression build as it gets to that kind of height of that little short note, little crescendo there. So that's another thing to look for. If we go back to the beginning here. So we've talked about the velocity, the expression. Another thing you can do is the tempo. I don't know if you've heard it when I'm playing this, but there's actually a small tempo change. So if most DAWs have tempo tracks, and if I open it up here, you can see that when it starts, this little passage starts at 125 beats per minute, and it slowly ramps up in kind of an animated way with a little push up to 30 beats per minute, and then tails off again right after that. So what you're telling the player, like a real violin player is going to play with emotion, and no violin player plays the same exact tempo throughout the whole piece. It would be impossible unless you're a very practiced drummer that could stay right on the beat. most musicians vary in tempo slightly. And sometimes they tend to build up in emotional passages. So to grab a hold of that idea, you can simply draw in a slight increase in tempo as it builds to that crescendo. And you might want to also build up how fast your ramp builds up too. And if you're into animation, animators know how to push and pull animation keyframes in just the right way. It has a lot to do with how your ramp acts. So, but just as a quick idea, just change your tempo to match and to move a little bit with your crescendo of your musical passage. That's another idea. So that's number 6. So we have that also going. Then another thing you can do, and is really handy, is there's nothing saying that you have to have just 4 tracks. You have unlimited tracks. I could take this violin idea here, and if I wanted to add some very specialized articulations, like maybe a harsh staccato, and I could copy certain notes which I want for accent notes. So I would copy certain notes and paste them into a new track. So I would just duplicate this violin track. I would go to duplicate that track, and I would just copy and paste a couple accent notes, which would have a very special articulation on them, maybe a very harsh violin staccato or something that I could use for accents and key places. So being aware of having the ability to add very key accents in your musical passage. Number 7. Number 8, you can move notes around. There's nothing saying that you have to stay exactly on the musical idea, the MIDI data. Obviously, you can change it to however you like. And that might mean splitting up a note to get a very sharp, and if I zoom in here a little bit more, you may want to set your system up here for very short notes. So I can split this. If I go to the scissors here, just cut that, and then I can take this note and either get rid of it or move it up, and that might just add a little extra, and then I may grab this note and make it a harsh note or a very fast spiccato note. So there's nothing telling you that you can't just split up certain notes and add a little extra finesse and accents and moving your data around. So I wanted to mention that you can move your data and you can split it up and add a little extra where you need it. Another thing you can do is in your VST, usually there'll be a controller for attack. So if you have staccatos, I know the VSL has a really good player with a lot of options, but I imagine the same you could do in something like Spitfire or some other larger libraries. And that basically the attack is, if you looked at one of my past videos, I think even the last one I did on Melodyne, and you've seen the shape of the attack of a drum hit. Well, this is kind of the same thing where you can determine how fast you want that initial sound to attack. You want it very fast and snappy, or a very kind of dull attack. So changing the attack and release on a per articulation level is another thing you can do. You can have each articulation set up for different attack and release. So that's another thing you can do to bring more realism to your MIDI data. And of course, it may seem obvious, but how you pan your instruments. The VSL, if we go to the mix, you can see that every track is mixed and panned according to the laws of real orchestra. And the same with reverberation and the room sound. You can see that they divide them up. And that's one of the reasons I like the VSL. And a lot of other libraries, they'll have it they'll have the violins in place in the room where violins should be, second violins, violas. So they'll have the panning pretty much taken care of, unless you want to do your own panning. But you have to be aware that panning is going to add something to your performance and how you pan every instrument. And I'll mix this up to what the next one is reverb in space. you want to have a realistic space. You want to have each instrument placed that makes sense. So if your violins, if you want a small quartet, you want reverb and room space to be a intimate small setting, and your mics you want to have reflect that. So you want to have your samples set up in a similar way that a quartet would play. In this case, again, I'm using the example as a string quartet. But basically what I'm saying is you want to take into account panning, reverb, and your room space and microphone setup to reflect a realistic actual players in a recording situation. So reverb, panning, and the room space, acoustics, all should be thought of and taken into account. And again, the VSL does that pretty much out of the box, and you can of course change things. In this case, I'm using the sound, the natural reverb of the synchron stage, but I've taken off the room reverb that they've added, and I've glued it all together on my mix bus with just a Fab Pro Q small little space to tie them all together more naturally. So I'm using the natural acoustics of the synchron room for the basic reverb and acoustics, but just a small little intimate space to tie them together, the four instruments together on the mix bus. But there's all different ways you can look at that. But be aware of your space, your reverb, and your panning. And of course, you want to be able to mix and master this when you're all done. When I do my little music passages, often I will just stick on a Andrew Shep's omni-channel, and there's so many great presets. A lot of great people have come up with presets that make sense. In this case, I'm using Soothe My Strings, something that just enhances the sound of strings on my mix bus. And if you're mastering, you would want to add some kind of mastering, and you could spend hours and hours on mixing and mastering, panning and reverb. That's not the point of this video. So that's about it. I'm just going to play the passage again with everything on. First we'll play it how it was. So we'll go back to the original idea, play that from the beginning. And then if you take into account some of the ideas I've mentioned, and there are others, maybe in the comments you can leave your ideas too, but these are some things that'll help you to get more of a realistic sound. Alright, so that's the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good evening, have a good day wherever you are, and we'll see you on the next video.